Don't settle for fakes. My dual-taining is the real deal.
Hello everyone, this is mekklord and welcome to the top 10 best mini boxes in the history of Duel Links. Just like last time with the main boxes, my objective this time is to take a look at all the mini boxes that came out throughout Duel Links' history and argue which ones are the best even to this day. But first, some honorable mentions, starting with Empire of Scarlet. Empire of Scarlet had two very potent archetypes in the form of vampires and insectors, and though vampires I think did become the best decks of the current metagame, I don't think insectors saw any competitive play. At most it was a niche rogue deck, but still very enjoyable to play. The other reason why this mini box is in honorable mentions and not in the main list is because it was kind of lacking in terms of generic support and staples. The second honorable mention goes to Dawn of Destiny. Now this is the mini box that introduced Nephthys and Fire Kings to the game, and this deck would go on to become one of the strongest contenders in the mid to late DM era metagame. This box also contained a lot of good generic cards, including Offerings to the Doom, Super Rush Headlong, which believe it or not used to be the best combat trick in the game, Heavy Knight of Flame, which also, believe it or not, used to be a really good monster to put into any deck. And a budget archetype in the form of Naturius, which was my personal favorite back when I started playing Duel Links. The main reason why this box is not in the main list is because, well, it is very old and none of the cards in this box are really good anymore, unfortunately. And last but not least for the honorable mentions, Servant of Kings. Now this mini box did not really have any interesting archetypes, at least in my opinion, but it did have so many incredible generic staples. Wall of Disruption was considered the best trap in the game for a very long time. Forbidden Chalice is still very playable to this day. Painful Decision has found some use in Pendulum Shells, most notably Metal Foes, and System Down is a side deck staple in formats in which machine decks are a bit too dominant. Unfortunately, like I've mentioned, this box did not really contain anything worth your time or investment other than these staples, which by now can be attained with, SR tickets. Onto the list proper, starting with number 10, Visions of Ice. This mini box introduced spellbooks, everyone's favorite spellcaster engine that is still used to this day in, Dark Magician, Psychic Blink FTK, a couple of decks. Back in the day, alongside the release of the Silent Magician structure deck, this deck was basically Tier 0 and Cries of Pay to Win quickly overwhelmed Konami, I'm sure. So not only did this mini box have a very good and very playable deck, even somewhat to this day, it also included some very interesting staple like Dragon Ice and this trap card, I'm sure you've heard of it before, called Treacherous Trap Hole. All in all, a pretty decent mini box if you ask me. Coming at number 9, we have Photon of Galaxy. I made a joke in another video about how garbage this mini box was, but this couldn't be farther from the truth. This mini box contained so many good generic Xyz monsters: Abyss Dweller, Steel Swarm's Roach, Malevolent Sin, Photon Strike Bouncer. It was just incredible. The cover deck of this mini box, being Galaxy/Photon, wasn't half bad either. I think it was somewhat decent, maybe a bit underpowered, but playable. And of course this deck also came with some very interesting support for the Onomat deck, specifically on the Dododo side, and more specifically Dododo Dwarf Gagaglov, which was a godsend for the deck. At number 8, we have one of the last, if not the last, mini box released in the DSOD era, Arena of Sanctuary. Now this mini box introduced a lot of support for Karakuris, which was already a decent deck as of 5D standards, but this support propelled the deck to tier 1 status very quickly. It also introduced a secondary playable archetype in Valkyries, which were never really competitively that good, but still have their fair share of fans. Some generic good cards in the form of Purple Trishula and Karma Cut, which also for a very long time has been considered one of the best trap cards in the game and very infuriating to face, especially during Blue Eyes formats, and support for a small but very niche archetype beloved by many called Triamid Sphinx. At number 7, we have Sign of Harpies, and this minibox was first exploited for the FA cards in it, believe it or not. With the insane synergy between the FA cards and the level augmentation skills, this basically ensured that you had an engine that could churn out a macrocosmos on legs that was very difficult to beat over, which wasn't fun for anyone, especially if the shell you were playing it in were Dark Lords, which was still one of the most contentious deck of the format. After this has been taken care of, the minibox was still worth exploring for the very powerful archetype of Harpies included in this minibox, which would become one of the dominant forces of the late Zexal / early Arc 5 era. And last but not least, I think it included some decent staples, but the only one I can think of right now is Lightning Vortex, which would become power crept with the release of Dark Hole. At number 6, we have Dimension of the Wizard. This minibox is infamous for introducing the Stromberg archetype, I guess, into the game, with the keycard being Golden Castle of Stromberg and the only SR needed being Give the Phantom Bird, which is basically a terraforming for the deck and also an MST, because why not? It was a very decent archetype that saw a lot of play throughout the ages and easily tripped up a lot of new players who didn't bother reading the card, basically. It also included the toxic duo of Psychic Wielder and Tracker, the former still being playable in a lot of decks including Cristrons to this day. Some Mudolce supports in the form of Mageline and Hoodcakes, which are very important for the deck. And I think even a card like Rocket End was played at the time because of its synergy with Amazonas Swordswoman, and Amazonas was still one of the most potent deck out there, and burn strategies were still really prevalent. At number 5, we have Force of Infinity, which introduced 3 of my favorite archetypes in the game. Mekklord, well, it's more like Mekklord's got a lot of support in this minibox. Abyss Actors, which up until that point had been relegated to 1 card, which was a Silvio drop. And Dynamis, which was basically the budget option and a very good OTK deck for what it's worth. This set also introduced a couple of good generic support cards. Oddai's Meteor Burst Dragon is basically a better Samurai Destroyer for the decks that can make it, and easily accessible for pendulum strategies with Noble Dragon Magician. And Santa Claus was basically one of the first kaijus introduced to the game. I think it came before Volcanic Queen. It came after Lava Golem, but this is the first, if I'm not mistaken, single tribute kaiju in the game. At number 4, we have Rampage of the Forest. This is the Sylvans minibox, and if you've never played during this era, let me tell you, Sylvans was the deck to beat. By and large, people were starting to play for Bed Chalice in order to chain it to the damage step effect of of the Shroom guy. This minibox also had some decent insect support that I'm sure could potentially see play in the future, stuff like Doomdozer and Resonance Insect, but also had some really good generic cards. Memory Loss was not a bad card by any means, and what's this spell card over there? Oh, it's H-Runade, one of the most divisive cards to this day. I believe it should still be banned and never come back, but you'll find people arguing the opposite any time of the day. Speaking of the deck to beat, the next minibox is Phantom of Rebellion. That's right, this is the Phantom Knights minibox, and if you've played recently, you'll know that Phantom Knights is basically the best deck. Again, for like the 7th consecutive metagame. This deck has seen play throughout every metagame since it's released, even after several nerfs and new archetypes power creeping it. It's just that good of an archetype. To be fair, this minibox also came with 2 other less impressive archetypes, Infinitrax, which would get completed in Lord of Borwall with their Xyz and Link monsters, and Ciphers, which were basically just another way to play Galaxy that was even more OTK centric and predated the release of, actually good Galaxy cards in Earths of Xyz. But what then could be better than the minibox that introduced Phantom Knights to the game? I'll tell you. Number 2 is Guardians of Rock. This one introduced 2 potent rock archetypes in the form of Triomids, which were playable and rogue at worst for a very long time, up until recently I believe, and Magnets, which according to some lesser player, used to be the best deck in the pre-Phantom Knights / early Phantom Knights meta, which sure is an opinion that people actually had. Can you believe this? Nonetheless, these two decks were very powerful and playable for a long time and still have their fans to this day. Speaking of rogue support, this minibox also introduced Block Dragon, which doesn't show up too frequently right now, but I'm sure could be easily used and abused by future rogue archetypes, like, you know, have you heard of Adamanticipators? And last but not least, for some obscure reason, this minibox also had some Dark Magician support. Eye of Timaeus was one of the cards that people showed a lot of interest in, but I don't think it ever did anything too spectacular, unlike Magician Navigation, which to this day is still one of the best Dark Magician cards ever released. And finally, at number 1, we have Land of the Titans. Finally, at number 1 for real, we have Spirit of the Beast. What? No Art of Xyz? What are you thinking, mekklord? Well, listen to me. Spirit of the Beast is one of the first miniboxes released in the D-Sod era. I think it might even be the first, if I'm not mistaken. And it introduced a very powerful archetype in the form of Ritual Beasts. This deck still showed up in some recent KC Cups because it was just that potent and that good at tripping up opponents. This is one of the decks that got nerfed really quickly in the early D-Sod era, and it was still played and beloved by many players. I've never understood it, but apparently a lot of people did, so good for them. A secondary archetype of this minibox was your Zenjus, and though they were missing Kama 1, they had all the altered tools required to succeed: Kama 2, Kama 3, and most importantly, Sword Sting. No, not Sword Sting. What's the one that bounces back to the end? I've forgotten the card name. Sword Slash? Wind Slash? Wind... Your Zenjus, Wind... something. I gotta Google it. Give me a sec. Never mind, it was Sword Sting. This minibox also included support for another fan favorite archetype in the form of Cristrons, specifically Crystron Thistvern and Impacts, which I think were the missing pieces required for the deck to become a meta-dominant force, which it became. It gave Magnet players some support in the form of Magnetic Field, and last but not least, it had some of, well, one of my favorite generic trap cards in the game, Super Team Body Force Unite, a card that has seen play throughout a lot of metagames. It was decent in Gookies, it was good for Desperado decks, I think it was decent in Ancient Gears also. It's just a fun card and a very excellent way to trip up your opponent as well. For all of these reasons, and considering the context in which it was released, I think Spirit of the Beast is still, to this day, the best minibox ever released. And that will be it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you're asking why I didn't put Art of Xyz in this list, it's because this box is not self-sufficient. You need to dig into other main boxes if you want to play Burning Abyss. You need to dig into another mini box if you want to play Galaxy. I think you need to dig into another main box if you want to play Trains. It's a really good mini box. You have all these components, but unfortunately not enough. This has been really difficult picking mini box to put in this list. I was expecting mini boxes to be less good than main boxes, but the opposite happened, and there's so many mini boxes that I wish I could have talked about in this video. Fortress of Gears is really good. Whichever mini box at the Fur Iron Monsters is also decent, but none of these are as good as the 10 that I've chosen for this video. Either way, feel free to argue in the comments section about which minibox should or should not have been there. Thank you for watching once again, and I'll see you guys and gals and non-binary pals next time.